Okay, good morning everybody. We might make a start. I think the pull of Bougainville has taken many participants to the other lecture theatre.
Bikatawa Plus.
Bikatawa Plus, oh sorry. Okay, so this session this morning is on the 2017 PNG elections. We're going to have two substantive presentations, one by Ariane Kasman, who's the Executive Director of Transparency International PNG, who's going to present on the findings of the TIPNG observation. And then following that, I'll do a presentation looking at some of the findings of the ANU SSGM observation. And then we'll be joined on the panel for questions with Barbara Thomas, who was involved in as one of the observers as part of our observation team. And Barbara is now the PNG projects coordinator at the Institute of Human Security and Social Change at La Trobe. So we're really pleased to have both Ariane and Barbara join us on this panel. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Ariane.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to get my presentation onto the screen. So last year, PNG held its 10th national parliamentary elections, and it was the third elections observation that Transparency International carried out an observation in. And now, so just quickly, TIPNG is a chapter of Transparency International, and it's a global movement against corruption. We share one vision, and that's to see a world free of corruption. TIPNG was set up by like-minded Papua New Guineans. So the late Sir Anthony Siaguru was our founding chairman, and together with other Papua New Guineans, including Dame Meg Taylor, set up Transparency International in Papua New Guinea because they saw that corruption was a problem and something needed to be done to raise awareness with the people about what corruption was, about what poor governance was, and what we could do as Papua New Guineans to help fight this deadly disease. So we work with all sectors to create change. And in the end, we feel that everyone is responsible, everyone plays a role in securing the change that we want. So a bit on Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea exists within very similar margins of many developing countries in the world. We have our issues with crime. We also have development that's taking place at a very rapid rate, especially with APEC coming up in November. We have non-communicable diseases, we have religious denominations, traditional heritage, different traditional cultures and customs, poverty, and of course corruption is something that affects us greatly in Papua New Guinea. So there are four main reasons why Transparency International observes elections in Papua New Guinea. The first is to provide an independent report to the Electoral Commission on the gross abuse of the election process. Secondly, to be able to report to citizens on whether the elections were free and fair. Thirdly, to encourage better and more transparent processes. And finally, the most important one, I feel, is to show citizens that they can contribute to the integrity of the electoral process. So just some basic facts from the 2017 elections. Papua New Guinea uses the limited preferential voting system. So we have, on our ballot paper, we have our first preference that we put down, our second preference, and our third preference on the ballot. The winner is declared after they obtain 50% of the votes plus one. There are 89 open electorates and 22 regional seats. So in total, 111 seats during the elections that are up for elections. Last year there were over 3,000 candidates, of which 165 were women. It was projected that there were about 5.6 million eligible voters that were registered. Of course, throughout this presentation, and I'm sure through Nicole's presentation, you will see some of the issues that came about from the electoral roll. And there were over 10,000 polling stations throughout the country. So this is, as I said earlier, is the third election observation that TIPNG has observed in, with the highest number of domestic observers nationwide. So we had 313 observers that covered 536 locations. We believe that through carrying out these observations, issues in the electoral process can be identified and addressed by the responsible agencies, stakeholders, and others. The wide range of volunteers that took part in the observation on TIPNG's behalf, and we at TIPNG believe that observation is a key role for civil society in any country, and most importantly is crucial for Papua New Guinea. So here are a few photos from the field taken by our observers. We had 313 observers that participated and assisted in capturing the data that we needed to produce this report. So this was the report that we produced. We covered 536 polling stations and carried out 1,527 voter interviews. The observation overall addresses one research question, and that is, are basic electoral rights protected and are basic procedures followed? So the report is divided into 4 main sections. The first describes and reflects on our observation efforts. The second outlines the results of the observation itself. The third analyzes the possible causes and consequences of the issues. And finally, the last section provides recommendations to the Electoral Commission, our donors and other stakeholders on ways to improve the electoral process. And so we start by looking at some of the key findings throughout our voter survey. So a third of voters reported that their voting rights were taken away. We at TIPNG believe that this was unfair and this was wrong. There were delays in voting. A clear example in Port Moresby, the capital city, polling was delayed for 3 days. We were told due to polling officials not being paid. Another reason was that the polling officials did not get the stationery they needed, or they didn't receive the ballot papers they needed to carry out polling on the day. Now, 1/3 of the voters interviewed reported threats to voters on polling day if they did not vote for a particular candidate. So I voted in Port Moresby in the Moresby Northwest electorate, and when I turned up at the polling booth in my area, there were police everywhere. They had high-powered guns with them, and they were screaming at everyone to stand in line and vote. And I was scared to go and vote, but I had to vote because throughout the lead up to the elections, I was telling people that this was a democratic right and they had to exercise it. But I did so in fear because of all that was happening around me. The bribery has become, to some extent, unfortunately, normal in many communities in Papua New Guinea. Not only were candidates offering bribes, also voters were demanding that bribes be paid to them. The lack of knowledge of the electoral process was evident in the way the secret ballot was carried out. Clearly, if our democratic traditions are to be protected, the secrecy of the ballot must be dealt with better. So there are instances where, and as you see in the pictures, a number of people can see who this person is voting for. In the picture on the top, the lady is getting assisted by someone. Now we're not sure if the person is actually writing what the lady is saying, her preferences, or if it was the guy who was writing his preferences. Now, the use of indelible ink was an important measure to prevent multiple and double voting. But still we see in 23% of polling places observed, they never used the ink to mark voter fingers. There were instances where the ink was just sitting on the table on the side and wasn't touched at all. In some areas, the officials were told by the people, by the voters, not to use the ink. Of course, in my electorate, or in the polling station I went to, they dipped my whole finger into the bottle, so the ink was on there for over a week. So it varied from place to place. Again, 37% of the polling locations observed reported that voters' ballot papers were used without their agreement or presence. I'm not sure if you have a chance to, you can look up, I think there should be a video that's online. There was a video that went viral in the first week of polling of young men that were filling in ballot papers under a house at an army barracks. And we thought this was enough evidence to declare that particular electorate a failed one. Unfortunately, because no one turned up in person to actually file the complaint, it wasn't, the results were accepted. Another alarming finding was that in 77% of the locations, genuine voters were not able to vote. So these results tell us that there was a huge issue and concerns about the overall administration of the elections. Now again, voting in secret is an essential part in achieving a free and fair election. Yet we find in this case, in 19% of polling places, voters never voted in secret, and 13% that were interviewed said sometimes people were able to vote in secret. In the Highlands region, more than 50% never or sometimes voted in secret, and in the New Guinea Islands, 30% never or sometimes voted in secret. So the past elections that have taken place, as Dr. Nicole Haley mentioned yesterday, usually it was a particular region that had, well, mostly the Highlands region, where these things were more common. In the 2017 elections, we saw widespread throughout the country. Southern region, where I'm from, where I thought that this could not possibly happen, it was normal. Everyone carried on as if it was something that, you know, all of that was democratic, that was right, and it was really shocking for me to witness this, especially in the region where I'm from. Now, women's participation was another issue. Yesterday we heard about some of the challenges that women that want to assume leadership roles face, but it was also women that were trying to vote that faced a lot of issues. So here in this picture are women lined up waiting to collect the ballot paper to ensure they vote. Whether or not they were able to is another story. Mind you, polling in the Highlands region was scheduled for one day, and in places like Goroka in Eastern Highlands province, the ballot boxes arrived after lunch that day. Now, interestingly, for both men and women alike, the occurrences of bribery and intimidation of voters during polling is another great area of concern. Instances of bribery and intimidation are unacceptable. Money, threats, and coercion were used predominantly, and while these were the results from the observation, one can only wonder what percentage was actually reported to the police. So TIPNG witnessed many instances where there were flaws in the electoral roll that made voters miss out. We had a toll-free hotline available to assist people who needed to know, for example, where could they vote, where was the nearest polling station to where they lived, what time would it open, or what day would the polling station be set up, or to report instances of corruption. And many of the calls that came through on that toll-free line were about people reporting that they'd been turned away, and they wanted us to call the commission and find out if there was a way they could vote. I remember one instance where I answered a call, and it was a caller from West New Britain, and the man was saying, I really want to vote. I voted in the last election, and I don't know why my name is not on the roll. So I asked him, have you gone to the election officials? Have you spoken to the police? And he said, they directed me to call this number. Yeah. So many people reported that they were being turned away. There was widespread abuse of voters' rights by way of double voting, multiple voting, and then of course block voting. So we know that in the 2017 elections, there were a good number of people that were denied their right to vote. It's not fair that these people lost their right to vote in this election. The buying of votes, even at polling booths, seemed normal, yet this is unacceptable. The right to vote in secret is fundamental to a free and fair election. So when we looked at a lot of the issues that took place during the elections, of course this started well before polling took place, we saw that there were so many issues that led to what took place at the 2017 elections. And so in our report, we grouped all of our recommendations under four key areas. And we advocated for a whole of society approach to addressing these issues of concern that were identified. So we had 4 key recommendations. The first one was to strengthen the enforcement of electoral laws. One such example we thought would be for law enforcement agencies to create a mechanism for dealing with violations of election laws during elections. The second, the electoral roll update and verification. We, at the time of presenting this report, had advised the Commission that it needed to start as soon as possible and it needed to be done more transparently. So there was an avenue that the Commission used, which is an online system where you could check your name. But we know instances where your name was on the roll online, but they couldn't find it in the paper roll that was printed out at the polling station. And in some instances, if you showed that your name was on the online roll, they would let you vote. So a lot of work needs to go into improving the electoral roll and coming up with a better way of verifying voters. The third, of course, most important one was to improve security and prevent violence. The agencies in charge of the coordination of security must have ample time to plan and enough resources to implement the security strategy. I think the 2017 election showed us that violence during the elections had increased significantly. On the first day when campaigning started, there was a death in one of the islands regions, so in West New Britain, a place where people thought that it's peaceful, a lot of tourists go there, but that was where the first death was recorded. Throughout the elections, of course, we saw policemen that were killed, that were caught in the middle of tribal fights. So a lot of violence during the elections. In some areas in the Highlands region, there is still fighting ongoing. And of course, that resulted in schools being shut down. And hopefully, next year, those schools can also reopen. The fourth one is election awareness. Last year, in the lead up to the elections, there wasn't much election awareness done. What I understand is the Electoral Commission received their materials 2 weeks before polling was going to start, and so they put up the posters at the polling booth. We feel that public awareness is important, civic education is important, and it must start as soon as writs are returned in an election. So we have a 5-year period where we should be educating the people on process, talking to them about what's right and wrong, and trying to identify what are the issues or what are the challenges that are being faced by the people that's contributing to some of these issues that we're facing, or the issues that we faced during the 2017 elections. So it's so important that as a country, Papua New Guinea works to make 2022 a free and fair election. It's not just the role of the Electoral Commission, there's also other partners that are involved, and all of us should be working together to help improve the next election. So while there were many challenges, there are also more opportunities for us to make 2022 2022, a better, free, fair and safe election. When we presented our report to the Electoral Commissioner in November last year during our integrity seminar, it was not just him present to accept. The Deputy Prime Minister, Honorable Charles Abel, also attended, accepted and acknowledged the report. And at that time, the Commissioner and the Deputy Prime Minister had advised everyone in the room that steps were being taken to start improving parts of the electoral process. We feel that partnership is important and is invaluable to this discussion, and we need to work together to build coalitions. We need to strengthen our relationships with these institutions, and we need to take ownership of this democratic process. Take responsibility and be part of the solution. Now, you would have seen in the last couple of months, there are also quite a number of proposed amendments that have been brought forward to make changes to the organic law on the national and provincial local level government elections. There's about 14 in total. Currently, they're doing regional consultations to get the views of the people. But of course, one of the more contentious ones that's up for discussion is changing of the voting system from limited preferential voting back to first past the post that was used previously. At TIPNG, we've been putting out strong statements against this decision being made because LPV was not the issue in 2017. The issue was the electoral roll. The issue was the enforcement of election laws. Procurement and financing was another issue. They had a lot of personnel and HR issues that took place during polling period. And then, of course, security was a big issue also. So there's a lot that that we've tried to do in the last couple of months. A lot of our focus has gone to doing voter education at the local level government for the local level government elections. Unfortunately, that was deferred 3 times. And so due to APEC and due to the earthquake disaster, has been moved to April 2019. But the Motu Koita Assembly elections will go ahead, and that will take place, I think, in the next few weeks. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions after this.
Thanks, Ariane. Okay. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack with this, and I will be presenting some findings from the ANU observation report. We haven't launched that report yet. It's very close to being finished, and we're just waiting for some feedback. But what we wanted to do with this session, and I think Ariane's presentation has framed that really nicely, was to look at the state of democracy in PNG, sort of through the lens of the election. And the title for this session and the sort of abstract came from the slogan for this election, which was "Your choice, protect the democracy, think, own and vote now." So I think that's quite a useful sort of lens to look at the elections through. The quote here is taken from the foreword to the then Electoral Commissioner Andrew Trawan's report on the 2013 LLG elections. Sobering as it is, it provides an apt preface to this presentation, which outlines some of the findings from the 2017 ANU SSGM election observation. DPA scholars, past and present, have undertaken long-term research on elections in PNG, including having coordinated 3 consecutive large-scale domestic observations. And as such, I think we're well placed to consider the state and the nature of democracy in PNG, taking a long-term perspective. Writing in the wake of the 2002 elections, Ron May described PNG as a disorderly democracy, signalling the oft-cited paradox of PNG politics, namely an unbroken record of democratic government and regular parliamentary elections, coupled with marked political instability and highly fluid politics. Since May wrote that paper, elections in PNG have become increasingly contentious, characterised by escalating levels of violence, money politics and electoral malfeasance. So how might the state of democracy in PNG be viewed in light of the most recent elections? I propose to explore this by having regard to the core characteristics of democratic elections. It is generally held that democratic elections are competitive in that they involve genuine choice, they're periodic, take place on a regular basis, are inclusive, involve a large proportion of the adult population, and that each person has a vote and that vote is equivalent in value. But first, a little about the ANU observation. As I said, it was the third consecutive large-scale observation we had undertaken, and it was the most comprehensive to date. It was funded in partnership by the ANU and the Australian Aid Program and involved 258 election observers. It comprised 32 PNG academics and researchers in team leader roles, 21 ANU-based or ANU-affiliated researchers in mentoring roles, and so as part of the observation we were joined by colleagues from Dev Policy and from the Lowy Institute and also some colleagues from Swinburne University. We also had 10 ANU undergraduate students who were part of the observation team and 192 Papua New Guinean observers drawn from civil society and the tertiary sector. As part of the observation, we deployed 35 small observer teams. They undertook detailed observations, and when we talk about detailed observations, we're talking 4 or more observers made detailed observations in 43 of PNG's 111 electorates, so that was 32 open and 11 provincial, and overall they undertook observations in 63 of the 111 electorates around the country. So it was quite comprehensive, and we think the findings for that reason are quite robust. Individual observers typically undertook 20 to 30 days observation over a 2-month period. But because of the extension to polling and the delays with the return of writs and the slow counting, several observers were extended and some undertook up to 50 days observations over that period. And they undertook observations during the campaign, the pre-poll, the counting, the polling and the counting periods. In total, the ANU observation team amassed 6,500 person days of observation during the election period, carried out observations at 945 of the 10,000 polling stations, and generated over 1,200 detailed polling reports. Observers also conducted citizen surveys during the pre-poll or campaign period and in the post-polling periods, surveying over 7,500 citizens. So how then did the 2017 elections measure up? Elections in PNG are in fact hyper-competitive. They're fiercely contested and they always attract a large number of candidates. So in 2017 there was 3,340 candidates nominated. 5 died before the elections actually took place. So that's why you see this sort of discrepancy in the number quoted. 70% of the candidates received a primary vote of 3% or less. And there was an adjusted turnout of over 100% in 1 in 5 electorates. However, many voters were denied genuine choice through block voting, coerced collective voting, violence, intimidation, and pre-marked ballot papers in many locations. 1/3 of citizens surveyed post-polling reported intimidation when voting, and 1/4 reported that they did not vote, and less than half reported that they voted freely. So this is there's a significant increase in the number of people who didn't vote, in the number of people reporting intimidation in this election compared to 2012. For the most part, PNG elections passed the periodic test, in that national elections have to date been held on time as constitutionally prescribed. However, the LLG elections were delayed in 2012, and as Ariane mentioned, the LLG elections have now been delayed 3 times, the forthcoming ones. There were also significant administrative challenges on many fronts. The electoral roll was deeply flawed, with the roll update process captured by candidates at the local level. Polling schedules were problematic in many locations and weren't adhered to. Counting was rushed in many places, and many of the checks and balances that we'd seen used effectively in past elections were dispensed with at many locations this time. In counting rooms around the country, officials employed what observers called a bulldozer approach to counting, which meant not doing quality checks, deflecting questions and queries from scrutineers, etc. And as we also saw, the failure to return all of the writs on time. Inclusion. Women do not participate in PNG elections as equal citizens. We know this. We know that they experience violence and intimidation at much higher rates than men report. Women don't participate in money politics in the same way that men do. Men receive more money than women. Men receive money more often than women, etc. Urban settlers were disenfranchised around the country. Polling schedules afford citizens in some regions greater opportunity to participate in the elections than others. And few polling stations were set up to meet the needs of the elderly, infirm, or people with disability. The much touted express lanes introduced for this election were utilised in very few locations around the country. So, we've just got a couple of slides here which present some of the tables from the report, looking at the gendered nature of money politics and comparing the results from the 2012 observation with the results from 2017. So what we can see is that in terms of the average across the country, and particularly in the Highlands and in the New Guinea Islands, the average amounts that people, men and women, are reporting having received have increased significantly. But what's marked too is the difference between what men and women are receiving, and that difference has actually increased significantly over the last 5 years. So whilst historically the research we've done in 2007 and 2012 demonstrated that men receive more than women, the disparity now is far, far greater. The other thing that we saw with this election in relation to money is that money is now concentrated in the hands of sort of key individuals, often strong men, etc., who are mediating the vote. So money was used quite differently in this election. Here as well are a couple of individual electorates where we have directly comparative data between 2012 and 2017. So if we take, say, the Hela provincial seat as an example, in 2012, 51% of men reported receiving money, and they received on average 352 kina. This time around 50%, so a very similar amount, but they reported on average receiving 1,731 kina, and the median amount was 1,000 kina, which means that at least half of the respondents received less than that and half received more. And different things. But you can see the quite significant differences there. You know, if you take Koroba Kopiago as an example, average amount for men was 880 kina, 69 kina for women. So, and the proportion of women in each of those electorates reporting that they receive money for their vote is significantly less than the men. Women also experienced intimidation and reported not voting at much higher rates than their male counterparts within individual electorates. So across PNG there, we've got all of the data aggregated to the national level. Only 2 in 5 women reported voting freely in this election. An almost equivalent number reported that they experienced intimidation when seeking to vote, and 29% of women across the country reported that they didn't vote at all. You can see then the breakdown of that for each region, and you know, clearly women fared poorly in the Highlands region and in NCD in particular. And there you can see, you know, just different ways of displaying those results. This then breaks it down by some individual electorates, and we've got this for all of the electorates that we covered, but I've just put a selection on here because they don't all fit on one slide. So you've got the Highlands electorates at the bottom, where you can see some really quite significant variation. So, you know, a very small percentage of women in Koroba Lake, Kopiago and Wabag open electorates reporting that they voted freely, etc. And some changes. So in terms of the electorates that we covered, better electorates were places like Yanguru Sausia in East Sepik, Ijivatari in Oro, and parts of the New Guinea Islands. But I think what's really interesting is if you look at those top 4 lines, and I hope that you can read them, you can see that even within the New Guinea Islands, which is often put up as the sort of the benchmark of good elections in PNG, that there's actually considerable variation there. So we see in Talisia, you know, close to 70% of women reporting that they experienced intimidation and did not vote. And that was the electorate that Ariane mentioned, where there was deaths in the nomination period, fighting that continued on through the election period. And in fact, the provincial police commander took to the press on several occasions talking about armed gangs of criminal networks that had been sort of captured by candidates, etc., for the purposes of the election. So we see even quite considerable variation in the New Guinea Islands. So obviously the full report details this for each of the electorates, but I've just got a bit of a sample, a taster here for you today. So what do these differences, one of the things that we would say is that the 2017 election was qualitatively different to the previous elections, to 2017 and to 2012. And so what I've got is some pictures here, just to contrast, of the same polling stations in 2012 and 2017 to show, well, I think it shows what I saw, which was that, you know, women are increasingly excluded from the process. So this is voting at Koroba Station in 2012, which had its own problems, which we've documented previously. But as you can see from the pictures, quite good turnout of women. We have a women's line there, we have women voting. We, in fact, the security situation was such that even children were voting. So in the top picture here, the very small boy is actually the voter. The ballot paper is being filled out on his behalf by a scrutineer. In the middle picture at the top, we see two children, both of whom are holding their ballot papers, waiting in line to mark their papers. And we can see in the photo at the top over there, a woman marking her own paper. Over here we have a woman voting, a scrutineer filling out the ballot paper for her. But we actually have women and children voting, which says something, I think, about the security situation. So these are the very same polling stations at Koroba in 2017. And these are polling stations that are set up inside spiked fences. So on the picture over there, you can see that inside the fence we've got mostly men. They're scrutineers here. This is the same, two pictures at the top of the same polling station. Scrutineers filling out the ballot papers for everybody, women and children outside the fence looking in. The picture below is outside the fence and inside the fence at Koroba Hospital. So again, women outside the fence, a mostly male group inside the fence, bit of a rugby scrum filling out all of the ballot papers. People outside, these two polling stations are on opposite sides of the same road, so they're about, 20 metres apart. The crowd eventually became quite rowdy, and they were trying to push over the fence, objecting to the fact that their ballots were being cast for them by other people. The security forces responded by getting into their vehicles and driving their vehicles at high speed into the crowd to disperse the crowd. So a very different picture to the one that I saw at Koroba in 2012 and in 2017. And I think for me, that sort of shows the quite different, the nature of this election. One of the other issues that I wanted to address related to electoral violence. Because a lot of people have come out sort of suggesting that this election was more peaceful than previous elections. And I think that that's something that our team would definitely disagree with. Over the course of the observation, our team members have recorded a number of deaths, and our colleague Steve started a table collecting details from the newspaper, and we've sort of continued with that. And so in total we recorded 204 deaths during the election period, twice as many as were claimed in relation to the 2002 national elections, which people often regard as the worst elections prior to this. Certainly in 2002, the elections failed in 6 electorates due to widespread violence and fraud. In addition to the 200 deaths that we recorded, and I say of those, 120 of those deaths are also documented in the PNG press. So there's also corroborating reports for those. In addition to those 200 deaths, several hundred people were seriously injured or maimed. Lots of cases of people having limbs severed, people being chopped across the country. Major property damage as well, including cars being burnt throughout the country, houses and trade stores burnt, government infrastructure destroyed and burnt. And in fact, of those 43 electorates in which we undertook detailed observations, there were only 6 in which there wasn't a death or major property damage throughout the election period. As you can see, probably not surprisingly, the majority of those deaths did take place in the Highlands, but there are deaths across all 4 regions. And as you can see there, they're also throughout the election cycle. So they start with nominations through the campaign period and through polling. So it's about half and half, with about half of the deaths happening during the nomination, campaign and polling period, and then the other half happening during the counting and post-declaration period. Okay. So another of the hallmarks of democratic elections is that each eligible citizen should have only one vote, and that those votes should be of equivalent value. Enrolments in PNG's open electorates vary widely and well exceed the legislative tolerance of 20%. Based on an enrolled population of 5.06 million and the number of open electorates being fixed at 89, the median enrolment or population quota is around 57,000 people. At the 2017 elections, 50 of the 89 electorates fell outside of the accepted range. There were enrolments of well over 100,000 in 6 electorates, and we have those there, and then enrolments of less than 30,000 in 5 electorates. So we've got this really marked discrepancy in enrolments. And beyond the diminished voice that this delivers to people in those electorates that have the high enrolments, it also has service delivery implications, because the development budget, or the District and Provincial Services Improvement Program, is distributed to MPs as a fixed amount without regard to the population of their electorate. Okay, the franchise of citizens in some parts of the country, and here I'm particularly talking about the Highlands, and in major urban centres, was further diminished in 2017 by the scheduling of polling, and specifically the practice of one-day polling. There is absolutely no doubt that voters outside of the Highlands and in non-urban settings are given greater opportunity to participate in the elections and do so in an environment of relative security, with kin and people with whom they are closely associated. So, for example, our teams in the New Guinea Islands, Mamase and southern regions all reported multiple instances of villages within the same ward being assigned separate polling days, and this is confirmed by the polling schedules. As a consequence, villages and clans supporting different candidates were not unnecessarily forced to come together at a single location on polling day. In the Highlands and in urban areas, however, this is not the case. Groups with diverse political interests and often with long-standing enmities are required to come together in a highly charged political environment. And it is hardly surprising then that voters in these areas report particularly high levels of violence and intimidation. Having regard to the polling schedules and voter enrolments in each district, we find that the average number of voters assigned, and this is the average number of voters assigned to each polling station in Angalim South Wagi was over 1,500 voters, that's the average, and there was polling stations there with over 3,000 people assigned to a single polling station. And the average number of voters assigned to each polling station in Ley was over 1,600 voters, right? Average polling station enrolments in Porgera Ligaya, North Wagi, Goroka and Wapanamanda also exceeded 1,000 voters. So at each of those polling stations, they're expected to process over 1,000 voters, over 1,500 voters in a single day. And as Ariane pointed out, at many places, polling started late and finished early in some cases as well. So there were many wards around the country in the Highlands with enrolments in excess of 2,000 voters, and in some case in excess of 3,000 voters. Right. By contrast, we find that average enrolments in Mamase, New Guinea Islands and Southern Region were in the order of 300 to 450 voters per day. And in several electorates in the New Guinea Islands, average enrolments didn't even reach 300. So we've got this really different situation where in the urban centres and in the Highlands you're expected to process 1,000 voters, and then in parts of the New Guinea Islands, Central Bougainville for instance, average of 128 people to each polling station. In Pomio, 185. Okay. Central Bougainville, which has an enrolled population of 39,500 people, had 308 polling stations. Similarly sized electorates in the Highlands, and here I'm talking Shuave, 38,500 registered voters, or Karamui Namane, 39,500 voters, were assigned just 69 polling stations each. So, one day polling, 69 polling stations. Right? The similarly sized LLGs, now some of these big electorates that we talked about with over 100,000 people have single LLGs that have the same number of registered voters as there are in Central Bougainville. And I'll give you two examples. Lai Valley Rural LLG in Mendi Open has 38,500 registered voters. Or Kontna Rural LLG in Day Open has 39,000 registered voters. And they were assigned 51 and 50 polling stations each. So, if you lived in Kontna, you had 50 polling stations. If you lived in Central Bougainville, it was 308. So, really different approaches in different places. And that serves to disenfranchise people. As I said earlier, 1/4 of all citizens surveyed post-polling had not voted. And the number of people and the proportion of voters, and this is also interesting. So we've got 25% of people not voting at all. But compared to 2012, the number and the proportion of voters who reported voting multiple times was up around the country in all regions. Overall, 1 in 10 citizens reported voting multiple times, and 1 in 5 citizens in the Highlands reported voting multiple times. We asked voters, the citizens we surveyed, how many times they voted. Again, quite a difference between men and women. So men who voted multiple times voted on average 18 times. Women who voted multiple times voted on average twice. Outside of the Highlands, those who voted multiple times rarely voted more than twice. Okay. So, was 2017 more of the same, a continuation of 2012? Some people have suggested that's the case. I don't think so. I think 2017 saw the democratic processes hijacked in many places, capture of the election at many levels, voter registration and the electoral roll was highly compromised, electoral fraud was far more brazen and more widespread and more purposeful than 2012. Money politics was more widespread and of a different order. The level of violence and insecurity was unprecedented. There was extensive electoral fraud and malfeasance, and it all took place in a different donor environment. Was it flawed? Was it failed? Was it successful? Different people have different perspectives on that. We found that 2017 didn't improve on 2012. The 2017 elections were marred by widespread fraud and malpractice, extensive vote rigging, coerced collective voting, and the hijacking of destruction of ballot boxes, political gifting, and money politics. which was qualitatively different to previous elections. Problems with the electoral roll were increasingly evident in 2017 and appeared to have been exacerbated by the devolution of core administrative responsibilities to provinces. Throughout much of the country, the elections were flawed and lacked integrity. And despite the existing legal mechanisms which provide for the withdrawal of a writ once issued, these were not utilised in 2017. The apparent unwillingness to address the most egregious examples of fraud and malpractice should give cause for concern. And despite former Commissioner Andrew Trywin's bold stand in relation to the 2013 LLG elections, where he failed elections throughout much of the Highlands, the changes that we saw in 2017 do, as I think Andrew Trywin sort of predicted, undermine the legitimacy of the elections. They certainly wind back the gains and the strong messages delivered in 2013 through the failure of the LLG elections. The changes we've seen further degrade the electoral environment and serve to normalise poor voter behaviour and candidate behaviour, which has become increasingly evident over the course of the last 4 elections. The integrity of elections, we would argue, cannot simply be asserted, but it must be demonstrated. And failure to do so will, as Sir Andrew Trywin predicted, see PNG's international reputation severely eroded and undermine local confidence in the PNGC and in the electoral process more broadly. Restoring that confidence from here will be difficult. Okay, so I'm going to invite Ariane and Barbara to come and join me up front, and we'll field some questions if there are some. Maybe to start though, Barbara, is there anything that you would like to add in terms of reflections as a first-time observer?
Thank you. Thank you for having me as part of the panel. I joined the observation team along with, I'm part of a youth network, and I used to lead an organization called The Voice Inc. We work with young people in the universities, and we run what we call Centers for Leadership. And much of the conversations in the universities around much of the conversations in the universities prior to the election was around active citizenship and the role of civic duty, and the challenge of having that conversation on how young people can drive that conversation in the communities and in the villages, understanding and appreciating our challenges, and so when Nicole and the team invited The Voice to be part of that, we jumped at the opportunity, and a couple of young people in Goroka, in Ley, and in Pomosby supported the process. And throughout that, the process, we as a group provided a space to reflect on what we were seeing in the community. And when the process ended, a lot of our assumptions of how we thought change could happen in the community was smashed. A lot of the things in which our ideals of how we were talking about our understandings of how we could push the conversations, it was sort of it was smashed. So some of us who are young and idealist, and we're going to go and talk to people and talk to them about their rights and their responsibilities and why they need to vote and what type of leaders we need and the challenges that this nation is facing and why it needs to change. And many of you may have been aware in 2017 as well too, 2016 there was a really big student unrest on the campuses in PNG around issues around accountability and good governance and the frustrations of the people that there was a closing civic space and people did not have the opportunity to contribute to or hold their leaders accountable, or they felt that there was a lot of power concentrated in Waigani, and that people felt that there was this resistance of that space and opportunity to speak, and that institutions that were supposed to be holding people accountable to provide checks and balances weren't doing their work as well as they should have been. And unfortunately, those student unrest led into violence and the burning of buildings and students dying. One student died. And the reflection process after that was, maybe how do we look at understanding how change happens in this deeply political context of PNG? And how do we go about influencing the kind of change that we want to see? And after that, during the Christmas break before the elections, you had this large number of young people who went back into their communities and talked about good governance, and they were traveling the length and breadth of their districts and talking about why we needed to vote good leaders. Unfortunately, the results didn't really show. Unfortunately, the informal ways and the traditional ways of mobilizing and talking about power and coming around and supporting people were stronger. But in some places, like in Morobe province, you saw a shift that one party, Pangu Party, was able to dominate, and that was driven by people not voting for individuals but voting for the party and the ideals that that party stood for. And much of that conversations was led by young people. And in Finsefen, a young person was nominated to be the local MP. He was 29, probably the first young person to be elected into parliament. And he didn't play money politics. He wasn't a very wealthy person, but he used that conversation around. In Morobe, there was just a different conversation happening, how they didn't want the current party to get back in, and so people mobilized around that idea. Unfortunately, in other places, it didn't work that way. So thinking about change, thinking about how do you have these conversations and how do you work in your community, how do you understand the power dynamics in your community, how do young people understand the traditional systems at work and work with those traditional systems in order to influence. So those are some of our reflections.
Okay.
Thank you very much to all of you for the presentations this morning. I learned a lot. I'm just curious about a few things, so I'm just going to hand on my curiosity and see if you have some answers. To Dr. Nicole, I'm really curious about your figures broken down by age and the experience of young women and the experience of young men, particularly when it comes to, what kind of benefits they might get through the money politics and what kinds of harassment and intimidation they might face as youth. And I'm imagining men and women will have different, young men and young women will have different experiences. So I was just wondering if you could give us any insights there. And then to Ariane, thank you very much for your presentation as well. I think there was a figure there that maybe I thought you could explain a bit more. There's 77% I think of eligible voters who couldn't vote. So yeah, just what's behind that figure? Why is that figure so high? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the first question. Really marked differences between the experiences of young women and young men. One of the aspects of this election that I think was qualitatively different, and we've got lots of quotes in there from different people, from citizens and observers, were things around the elections now being just for the young and the strong. Those who were able, to force their way forward to the front of the rugby scrum, so to speak. Those who were less fearful of accepting money. I mean, there's a whole lot more to the work that we've done around money politics in terms of actually not just asking whether or not people receive money, but whether they themselves elicited that money or the gifts that they received, and whether or not they had the confidence to not accept gifts and money that were offered to them, and whether they had the confidence to be able to accept a gift or money and to be able to vote for a different candidate. And again, we see very different responses there between men and women. So men not only receive money more often and in larger amounts and gifts more often, they're far more likely to have themselves elicited that as a gift, whereas women are often receiving sort of token payments that are being sort of passed on by another family member, etc. And they don't have the same sort of level of confidence to knock that back. So yes, so we see quite significant differences there. A lot of the young women sort of surveyed through the citizen surveys didn't vote, and actually said that they didn't even try because the security situation was such that they didn't even want to sort of put themselves in that situation.
So the figure on 77% of eligible voters said that they were not able to vote during the elections. A lot of contributing factors. I think, first of all, the observers saw that a lot of people were turned away at polling stations. So in some places, I know, for example, in Bougainville, the referendum is taking place soon, and they will be voting. And so what we heard from Bougainville was that the people were confused on whether they should use the role that they have or the one that was sent through by the PNG Electoral Commission. And so polling was shut down on the first day because of some of those issues. I'm not sure what the polling officials at those particular areas decided in the end.
They used the PNG role. They
PNG
couldn't use the OBEC role.
And then in some situations, like at the University of Papua New Guinea, which is in Port Moresby, a lot of the people that were registered on the roll from 2012 previously had already left the university. So a lot of names were not on the roll. What I hear happened later on in the day was that in the end, the polling officials said, they were turning too many people away. And in the end, they said, if you produce a university ID card, you can vote. So a lot of these issues led to this figure coming out. And then in some areas, there was no sort of verification. You sort of just went and said, that's my name, and then voted. When I went to the polling station, I just said my name, and they checked it, ticked it, and they said, okay, proceed. So I guess for a lot of people, they may have gone up, and their names were either not on the roll, or someone else had already voted in their place.
So thank you. Really interested, I've got lots and lots of questions, but I guess focus on two if that's okay. One is, I guess the implications of if there is this serious question raised about the legitimacy of the election, I guess, Arian, a view as to how that should affect Australia's government's behaviour towards the O'Neill elected government is sort of one. And I guess, and I missed your name, I'm sorry, but love the insights in terms of the implications for change within PNG. You talked about the changes within the MOS and the role of Pengu. To then see Pengu join the O'Neill coalition, what other messages does that have for youth in PNG?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question to answer. Before the elections, we were asked, or I was asked a number of times, do you think PNG will deliver an election? Do you think we will successfully complete an election? Of course, when writs were returned, or supposed to be returned, there were a few that were still being counted, but they went ahead and they called the first session of Parliament into order. And I was there for that first Parliament sitting. And we had to wait a couple of minutes because there were two members for one particular electorate on the floor, and they didn't know how to sort it out, who to ask to leave the floor. It was a very confusing time. I think for me personally it was embarrassing. But as Papua New Guineans, we have this thing about, it wasn't the best election. TIPNG, in our view, was a flawed election. But we completed the process, or tried our best to complete the process. This is the government of the day that came about as a result of the elections. This is the government that we have to work with. So all of these challenges aside, it is the government in our country, and as an organization, we are committed to working with the government of the day to try and improve some of the things that are happening. So it's a difficult question to answer, but as a Papua New Guinean, as a citizen, they are the government. And in terms of Australia, I think it is clear that the Australian government will work with whichever government is declared at the end of the day. I think there were a lot of issues around the elections because the greatest support that we received during the elections was from the Australian government. So in terms of logistical support, security, all of those issues, and I think at some point Australia was blamed for some of the logistical challenges of getting a helicopter moving with all the ballot boxes. But sometimes we were looking for a quick way to give blame to someone else. A lot of these issues came about because we were not prepared, because we didn't have the conversations early enough, because we kept blaming money and saying there was no money to at least have a meeting. And I think a lot of lessons were learned, and in the lead up to the next elections, we are pushing for the meetings for the 2022 elections to start now, so that we don't face the same challenges that we faced in the 2017 elections.
Yeah, so just to answer your question, pretty disappointed in Pangu, and just a feeling of distrust. Already there's this notion that the government doesn't really represent the people, or represent the views of the people. So, for instance, why is money politics so rife in the communities? It's basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They think about the now, about whatever their basic, like what they're going to eat tonight. They don't care what whoever they're voting for, because when he enters parliament, he's not going to represent whatever their needs, because they haven't seen any tangible changes. The role of government is to provide that enabling environment for people to at least live a good life. And unfortunately for them, their reality is something else. So that notion of caring about that process is not there. That's the challenge.
Sorry, Paul's question about the Pangu changeover. Of course, if anyone's been looking at social media in PNG, there's real anger expressed against Pangu for having changed canoes or changed horses and jumped across into the government. That's a constant theme that comes across. And similarly, comments about the election, the legitimacy of the election as a whole, are very strong amongst the educated people who are using social media. There's a lot of nonsense on social media, but there are some very, very powerful critiques that are coming out constantly. But I had a question that was for Nicole, just a simple one. The connection between money politics, people getting money, and sometimes getting it from several candidates, and intimidation. Whether the money that is used in an effort to gain credit, buy votes, bribery, to call it bluntly, is accompanied with threats. We're giving you money, so you vote, and if you don't, watch out. Is that what's happening? That connection, I think, needs to be made.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, some really clear examples, like there was a couple of polling stations in Day that were ended up being shut down because it was the base vote of a particular candidate, but another candidate would turn up at the polling station and say, you know, I want a share of the votes for this polling place because I've given this. And they would like publicly account for what they had given at a particular place. So, and I mean, Trarwan talks about it in the report, the 2013 LLG report, but this sort of cutting the vote, you know, so scaling the vote and so we saw a lot of that where people had spent money and came, you know, demanding a share, and basically saying, if I don't get that share, then nobody here votes, you know. So, and we had examples of that where ballot boxes were destroyed for exactly that sort of reason. A lot of the post-polling violence, and some of the deaths that we recorded are actually on polling day itself, after the close of polling, because particular candidates didn't get the votes that they were expecting, where they'd paid money. We have other examples. I mean, talk about the impact of, you know, sort of mobile phones and social media. I mean, lots of examples of, you know, scrutiny is ringing through to candidates and saying, you know, you're not getting, you know, the votes here that you expected, and them being able to mobilise teams of boys to come in and shut down a polling station where they weren't getting the votes that they expected to be getting, you know. So if I'm not going to get the votes, nobody is. That kind of thing. So yeah, very much a link between those two things.
Can I just add? There was this like a noted expectation amongst people for payment for their vote as well too. So in some instances there was intimidation to, you know, that we'll give you money to vote for us. But in other instances, there was this, you have to pay me for my vote. It's a time in which I, you know, who's the highest bidder for my vote. And there were some instances, like in Mosby, right? A lot of voter education, especially done by civil society around voting for good leaders. And you ask a group of people, so these are, you know, some of, let's talk about leadership and why it's important to vote good leaders. And then people are like, oh yes, we'll do that. We'll make sure that we'll vote good leaders. But then after that, like, you know, when then ask them, oh no, I got this and that. And so, but we said, you know, we had a conversation. And said that wasn't, you know, right. Like, that we would base, you know, our vote based on certain criteria. And then the one person said, my dear, at the end of the day, it's about my needs now. Yeah, although it's ideal to do that, I'm faced with this now. And in fact, if I'm given that opportunity, because I know that when he goes into Parliament, he or she may not think of me.
Yeah, if I can just add on to what Barbara was saying, like in Central Province, where I'm from, I was embarrassed when I was turning up to villages and people were going up to vote. People from Port Moresby were traveling to the villages to vote. They'd go and vote and then they'd walk to a particular house, mark their name off, and then pick up a food pack, which probably had some cash attached to it. And this was normal. And it really, like Barbara was saying earlier, it really affected the way I looked at voter education and civic education. It really changes that space and that conversation. I think Barbara and I have discussed this in different group settings as well. The way voter education has been done in the last 20 years cannot be done the same way in the lead up to 2022. Values have changed, society has changed so much, and this focus on, like, I used to think that we didn't have any money in the country because people were struggling. Come 2017 elections, there was money everywhere. There were parties, there were all sorts of things happening. It was just a very noisy period in the country, well, especially in Port Moresby. But what I do remember from the 2012 elections is that we had that same issue where every night it was just constant noise all around the city. Just one day was the exception, and it was actually the night of, I think it was Game 2 of State of Origin. That was the only night where there wasn't any campaigning around Port Moresby. But you have busloads of people, especially students, candidates, hiring buses, collecting all these students from schools, and just driving around the city. To these young people, it's just an opportunity to get on a bus, get a free feed, get some money maybe. So there's a lot that needs to happen at very basic level. That's in the family and in schools at a very young age to change this perception that our people have. But I think it's very different in the rural areas, and because I'm in an urban center, I think the differences will show when you go to a rural setting and talk to the young people in a rural setting. But yeah, the conversation has definitely changed. Our approach has to change, and that's something that we are still trying to figure out with the groups of young people that we have to work with, and then of course the generation of people that are in positions of authority, but we can work together to try and make things better.
Maybe a question to Nicole, and it may have been partly answered by what Ariane's just said about the changes in the last 5 years, but I wonder if you could comment on why the situation seems to have deteriorated in the New Guinea Islands, and why the increase in money politics, which seemed really, really dramatic from your figures in the islands region.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing around the country is that a lot of practices, etc., that have historically been associated with the highlands are spreading throughout the country. So one of our colleagues, Patrick Matbob, who has led the teams in Madang for the last 3 elections, talks about the Highlandisation of Madang politics. I mean, the observers, Trish's auntie led our teams, Ariane's auntie Trish led our teams in East New Britain, and the same kind of sentiments came through. I think, Carol's presentation yesterday, you sort of alluded to the fact that a lot of the candidates in Ley were not from Morabay, they were from elsewhere around the country. So that in a lot of these places, outside of the Highlands, there are actually Highlands candidates that are running in other areas, and so sometimes they're bringing practices, etc., with them. There was a big in New Ireland, in particular. There was a very concerted effort, I think, to unseat the PPP candidates. So there was quite a bit of money employed there, and certainly in relation to the Namatanai seat. I mean, if we look at Schnobelt's nomination, was probably the most impressive in the whole country in terms of different things. So it took things to a new level. Certainly in New Ireland, it was also one of the places where, and this may be one area where matrilineal does come into play, where we saw almost equivalence in the amount that women received as men received in New Ireland. So, quite interesting.
Thanks. I've got 2 questions, really. So both presenters seem to stop short of labelling the elections failed. I think Ariane used the term flawed. But from what we've heard, it seems that women were, quite excluded from the voting process. We heard yesterday some of the presentations about the difficulties of women in sort of being able to mount credible campaigns. So was the 2017 elections a fail for women? And then my other question is just around campaign finance reforms, if anyone's talking about that and if there's an appetite to sort of address some of the money politics in that way.
Yeah, look, I think women were very much excluded from the process, and if you're a woman, the election wasn't free or fair, etc. There's a mechanism for failing elections. It's not for us to call that, but I mean, I think it is an area that there should be pressure applied to see those mechanisms, the Electoral Advisory Committee convened early, etc., and being given the support so that it can do the role that it needs to do. I think around, sort of issues of campaign financing. I mean, there's so many areas of the election that, there are laws and things that could be enforced that are not being enforced. So it's, and that's just one area. There were, there have been localised attempts in parts of the country to regulate, behaviour around elections. I think, Chimbu's an example where, they've sort of tried to regulate that with, sort of community pressure to see campaign houses only operate during the day and not day and night, etc. But I think the big issue is, and Barbara's alluded to it, is that oftentimes it's actually the citizens and the constituents themselves who, to use a top piston term, are aftering the money. And this is what what they're asking for and calling for in their candidates, because they don't have the confidence that they will get services and things down the track. So, elections are the time where, it's an opportunity, and that's where people see it.
So maybe just to add on, so the Election Advisory Committee, Section 96 of the Organic Law on provincial and national and provincial election states that the Election Advisory Committee has powers to advise the commissioner on whether or not an election should be held in a particular electorate. But what Nicole was saying, it is the commissioner himself that has those powers. Unfortunately, the Election Advisory Committee resigned halfway through polling period because they were not getting the information that they required in order to have their discussions and get back to the Electoral Commissioner. And so I think one of the things that we're pushing for, TIPNG is able to nominate or appoint someone to the Election Advisory Committee. This is required by law. And so what we're pushing for is that the EAC is called to form much earlier than what we saw last year, and that they're given the proper resources to carry out their role, to advise the commissioner if they feel that an election is not being carried out well in a particular electorate. On the second, so campaign financing again is a difficult one, but I think what Nicole was referring to was one particular example I know is Coop Women for Peace, who came together as a community as women and decided that they'd had enough. I think it was the 2013 by-elections where they actually had community laws that they wrote out themselves and said, okay, we're not going to have campaign houses, or they're only going to be for a certain period. And it was a community themselves that enforced that. So a lot of communities, especially in the Highlands, especially led by women, are trying to push this agenda, trying to make sure that they take responsibility and help to make sure that elections are, less violent. And we don't have these issues around social issues that come out after campaign houses are set up. So that's something that I really admired about especially the Coop Women for Peace. And I hope that it's something that other women in other communities can also adapt and practice in their communities as well. But there are proposed changes that are currently going through consultation, so through the Constitutional Law Reform Commission on that organic law. At the same time, there are proposed changes to the organic law on the integrity of political parties and the Candidates Commission. which also has a role to play in the elections. We didn't see as much voting along party lines as we would have probably preferred. I think Barbara mentioned Pangu, and of course Nicole mentioned the trying to unseat PPP, but the Integrity of Political Parties and Candidates Commission does have a role to play and needs to also come out and play that role and strengthen political parties and the administration of political parties. So there's a lot that needs to be done in different areas, but we need to communicate with each other to make sure that we're all on the same page with all the changes that are about to or proposed to take place.
I've just had the signal that I need to wind up. So, but I'm sure that my fellow panelists are happy to chat with people over morning tea as well if there's other issues that people want to keep discussing. But otherwise, we'll call this to a close and we'll go and grab some coffee.